What's up, everybody? It's Hank here with another special episode of Break MMA. I love having fighters on. Like, I love having, of course, this is a MMA podcast, so you got to have MMA fighters on. But to me, my favorite episodes are the one with Ty, John Sloan, Monstars MMA, other journalists, because, James Lynch, all these other people that actually cover it and love it as much as I do, because I'm sure, just like my guest here, she lives, eats, breathes, and watches MMA all day, every day. And I want all of y'all to welcome Kristen King.
Hey, how's it going, guys?
Yeah, she's definitely... how can they find you on Twitter, to look you up on Twitter?
You guys can find me at Kristen King MMA.
Yes, definitely go give it a look. All my people are very familiar with Ty, and me and Ty are actually fixing to start a show with just me and him. And
nice.
He speaks very highly of you. He's me and him have had a few episodes, and I have his personal number. I call him a lot, and he calls me a lot, and he speaks very highly of you.
Well, that's good to hear.
He says you definitely know your MMA. And yes, that's right, folks. I said she. She is a girl. And she does... A lot of people, we were talking a little bit off air, it's not really common, to see... Like, when you think of MMA reporters, you think of Ariel Helwani, number one, Luke Thomas, number two, and then you got Ramonde, you got Sean Al-Shadi. The list goes on, but... all males. They all have something in common. They're all men.
Yeah, exactly. I think when I first got into MMA media, it was all the men, and then I started to get familiar with a lot of the women. So I think there's a reporter, her name's Steffi from Bloody Elbow. I love a lot of her work and stuff like that. And then obviously my editor, Amy Kaplan. There's just so many other women that don't get enough shine. And I'm glad to be a part of that small group of women, but hopefully it becomes more common in the next couple years, I guess.
And I don't know if you could really call Escher Lynn. Is Escher Lynn just a photographer, or is she a reporter too? Is she like a journalist too?
I believe she's like a photojournalist, so a lot of her work is through her photography, but that's another one that was amazing.
She is amazing.
Yeah. I loved Esther Lynn's work when I first saw it and I first got introduced, but when I first decided to be a part of this whole group, I was like, I just know all the top guys. I know Ariel Helwani, I know Luke Thomas, I know Mark Raimondi, I know those guys. And then now I finally have some women that I can relate to when it comes to covering the sport.
Is it weird, talking to, because it's like you said, we'll say 95% men. So we're about 95%. I mean, the fighters too. We have female fighters, but I'd say most of your interviews and most of your podcast discussions are about men.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that weird because I know it's a male-dominated sport. I mean, that's no secret, and it's just one of those things that it works for it, I guess. And with the women, they become more and more prominent every day. I mean, some of the women are just as put up or in the same conversation as a lot of the men, especially someone like, Amanda Nunes, like we're getting ready to talk about. She's one of those that you consider along the names of the big guys in the sport. So it's definitely not weird. It's just something that I'm already used to with, it being male dominated. So it's one of those things that you just kind of, whatever. I get it.
Yeah. One thing Ty said too, that you have a very good story about why you got into MMA. So briefly, without, going too much, what...
Yeah.
Because, you know how MMA goes. I could go on like an hour talk about how I got into MMA and why I love MMA, just like I'm sure you could. And moments that we've watched and moments that we witnessed that we remember and that mean something. But in short, what made you think, first of all, you have to love MMA before you cover it. So first of all, what made you love MMA? And then what made you think, well, maybe I can turn this into my life?
So I started off watching boxing all the time with like my family. They're a completely boxing-oriented family. And one night there was no boxing on, and instead there was Strike Force on. And the main event was Chris Cyborg versus Gina Carano. And my dad was like, do you want to watch a girl fight? And I said, yeah, sure, whatever. So I watched that, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. Because at that time, I had no idea what was going on. But I do know that everyone was in Gina Carano's corner, you know. And after Cyborg did what she did, I was like, man, this is something that I could get used to. I could definitely start watching this. And then that time, Strikeforce wasn't putting out consistent content. So it'd be like a few more weeks for me to be able to watch it. But I knew that I wanted to watch it. So I kept looking for it. And then my uncle was already aware of the UFC. So he gave me some DVDs that I could look at. And I started off from like UFC 15 and then all the way up until like I started getting into the St. Pierre era. And from then on, I was just like, man, I love watching this stuff. And then I decided that I wanted to be a part of it, but not in the way that you think, not in the way that I'm doing now. I actually wanted to do public relations. And I thought, you know, maybe working with athletes would be a great idea. And the sport that I resonate with the most is MMA. But how do I break out into that? That's such a small, you know, role. I don't know how to do it. And then I finally saw a tweet from Luke Thomas about Fansided. And I was like, well, I could do some writing too. And then that happened like in April 2017. And then here I am now.
So, but did it ever cross your mind? Because, I mean, it might be different for me, you know. I'm only 24. How old are you?
23.
Yeah, so we're about the same age. So we probably...
Yeah.
What year did you start watching? Do you remember? Because, I mean, like, the year you started, not like the DVDs, but like started watching it as it was happening.
Oh, man, I can't pinpoint the exact date. I don't know when Gina Carano and Chris Cyborg was. I feel like it was 2008. I could be off.
So I was about 2005. I was a couple years before.
Oh, yeah. See, I had never heard of it before then. All I knew was boxing, and then that was just that one spark that kind of just got me interested into it. So it hasn't been that long.
But did you ever, like with me, I've got the gloves, you know, I hit mitts sometimes, I leg kick the bags. Yeah. Did it ever cross your mind, I want to fight, or that's not you? You're not a fighter?
Absolutely not. I was like, I think in my bio on Fansided, I say, is there a smaller weight class than atom weight? I am definitely not a fighter. I'm so tiny. I just like being a part of the sport in a way that I can get the stories and the news out to people who are also interested in it. But I don't know, maybe someday I would train. I've been invited to go train, but I just never took anyone up on the offer yet. But definitely not a fighter. No. I focus on the fighters themselves rather than me fighting.
A lot of people think they can. Like, a lot of people, like, they watch and they go, "Oh, it looks easy." And when I put the hand wraps on and put the gloves on, and when somebody punches you in the stomach or punches you in the head, it sucks.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's why I don't want to do it.
It takes a very interesting person to do that for a living, but that's why they get so good, you know, so you don't have to take those ass whoopings.
Exactly. I give credit to anybody that decides to put on some gloves and some headgear. You guys go right ahead. I'll just be on the corner writing about you.
But one of the actually great things that you can learn so much by just watching. Like, the people that watch, I was hanging out with my cousin, you know, and I showed him what a Kimura was, you know, and he actually was showing other people, and they watched it on a fight, and he said, "Oh yeah, I learned how to do an armbar from you." Like, you could just watch, and okay, we'll find out what a wizard is. We can find out what full mount means. You can find, you know, you slowly catch on. Like, we know what everything is right off the bat, but for somebody who doesn't watch or doesn't know, if you actually study and watch, you can learn a lot from fighting just from watching.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's always been like that idea that you have to compete in MMA to do what we do. And I don't always think that that's necessarily the case. I mean, you can definitely learn from watching, or you can definitely learn, because I've picked up some books from former fighters. I have books by like Forrest Griffin and stuff like that, just detailing what their career was like and what they did. And that's a phenomenal way to learn about the sport. It's not that you actually have to get in the cage and get your butt kicked. You can definitely just look at it and see. And you notice that a lot of it is repeated behavior. So by the time you figure out why that arm is bending backwards, and it's like, oh, that is a Kimura, you're going to figure it out by like the 5th or 6th time you see it happen on a fight night. Yeah. You know what I mean? So as long as you're watching, as long as you're reading about it, you're fine. You don't have to get in the cage and do whatever. So you can become like an official fan. You don't have to do any of that.
Yeah, like whenever I have, like somebody called me a journalist, and I guess you could maybe make the term journalist, but I'm not really a journalist. I don't get paid to do this. I'm not sponsored by nobody. I'm just a fan who decided one day that, hey, I wonder if I just reach out to these guys that they'll respond. And how I got Elias and Eric and all these people, just DM them on Twitter like, hey, I got a podcast. You want to come on? Yeah, man, sure. And it's that simple,
Yeah, isn't that crazy that I feel like this is the sport that a lot of fighters or a lot of people are definitely easily accessible. In other sports, like other major sports, like baseball, football, if I DM someone, they're not going to respond to me. They're going to think I'm a fan. But in MMA, you could say, hey, I'm doing this podcast. I'd love to have you on and speak to you. And the fighters are so responsive. And that's what makes it so fun, because you get to speak to these fighters that you never dreamed of talking about. And then you get great conversation.
Yeah, I ask questions a fan would ask. Like, how's your training camp going? All that bullshit. That's just average questions. I'm going to ask something, of course, sometimes that's one and the same. Like if I'm interviewing John Jones, I'm obviously going to ask him something about PEDs. I mean, you wouldn't be doing your job if you didn't. But at the same time, like as far as notes, and I take some notes, and write stuff down and prepare and do research, of course. But it's mostly just, hey, get on the phone and talk. That's basically it.
Yeah, I think if that was a piece of advice that I had gotten when I first came into this, is that it's just talk to them like they're a person. I think people get so caught up in trying to be so proper, and granted, doing what we do, you definitely have to be a little bit proper, because you never want to cross that line. But there are certain conversations and certain questions that are brought up, and it just makes the fighter so much more elated to speak with you, because it's not all business. I think one of my very first interviews that I had was with Phil Davis when he was getting ready to fight in Bellator in Italy like a few months back. We started talking about comic books and comic movies and stuff like that. That's how I finished off my interview. So I mean, it's just really good to just have that kind of, that human quality. Like, these are people too. Don't get so scared in trying to, straight a one line of questioning. You can definitely broaden your questioning and stuff like that, and just talk to them like a human, because then I'd say 9 times out of 10, they're going to enjoy it. We don't always have to talk about your weight cut. We don't always have to talk about your opponent. Let's talk about what kind of movies you want to go see, and if you want to go to the carnival next week or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It makes for a better conversation, and with a lot of people too, like having them on after a loss or having them on after something bad. They're in a bad mood. They don't want to hear you say, "Oh, well, why did you lose?" Okay, well, why didn't you win? They don't want to hear you say that.
Yeah, I think that's what you definitely have to, like, you just picture yourself in their shoes. You wouldn't want to answer these kind of questions, so don't ask them. I mean, I know that they're important to ask, and some fighters will give you some great responses. The response that, oh, I learned from a loss, rather than just sulk on one. Great, but chances are they don't want to talk about it. So let's talk about some entertaining stuff and something that's going to uplift you.
So the biggest news lately in the MMA world, we just had 232. I think I seen the report come out. I predicted that it would do 600, or I predicted it would do 600,000 pay-per-view buys. And I had a guy on, John Sloan MMA. You should definitely, if you don't know who that is on Twitter, look him up. He's another MMA media, and he said that he thinks it will do 1.1 million. And I said, that's what the UFC wants. The UFC wants John Jones to crack at least 1 million. And I'm pretty sure I seen a report on Twitter that said it did 500,000 pay-per-view buys.
Huh.
Is that would you lean more towards John's 1.1 or more towards my 600K?
I mean, I understand why the number of 600 would definitely work for you, but for someone like, for someone like John Jones, I would definitely think that they have an audience, but maybe a lot of his luster has been taken away because of the failed drug tests and stuff like that. But he wasn't the only one fighting on the card. You had one of the greatest women's fight in history to happen. So you had Amanda Nunes and Chris Cyborg also fighting, and I think that is also attractive to the average viewer. So it is a little surprising that it's just 500,000. I don't know if more will come out, or maybe that's just a preliminary number.
Yeah.
But hopefully more will come out, and maybe it's just a reintroduction into Jon Jones, because I think the last couple of years, all we had was to talk about his failed drug test. So now that we've seen him come back in such a dominant fashion, maybe more people will get reaccustomed to him as a fighter, and maybe the next pay-per-view, he'll definitely crack 1 million.
So, and I'm curious on this too, as your stance on Jon Jones. We know back in, the DUI, or it wasn't really a DUI, it was a hit and run, and then he got arrested. Did he ever actually do any jail time for any of these things?
I don't think that he did. I believe that he had some kind of warrant out, but he turned himself in, and I think it was dealt with through the courts. I don't think that he really spent time in jail. I'm not entirely sure.
So he's, to the best of our knowledge, he's never, because I remember there's that little scene that he's in that orange jumpsuit with the UFC, but then they probably just booked him and then he bonded and bailed and got out. But he had the crash and then the cocaine. I'm not sure which come first, the cocaine or the crash. I think it was the cocaine and the crash, and then he tested positive at 200, and then he comes back and fights DC and tests positive again. And his excuse for 200 was a dick pill. And his excuse for 214 was that he had no idea on how it got there. And now, all of a sudden, about a week, 6 days before this fight, news broke that he tested. They say he tested positive, but he didn't test positive. Basically, they're saying that he has he has trace amounts of picogram levels, which is very low. But before we get into all that, when you heard that, did you immediately say cheater, or did you say, maybe he's innocent?
At that point, I didn't know how to feel. I'm very middle of the road when it comes to Jon. I'm definitely a fan of his performances inside the cage, because in or outside of the cage, I really don't care what he's doing. He's a great talent, and he is one that the sport definitely deserves, especially in his earlier days. Just seeing that rise of a star, it was phenomenal. I was great. And then it started to get to that post-fight stuff and the drug tests and stuff like that. But I think this time around, I was just kind of like, I don't want to say it's expected, but it almost felt common at that point, because that has been the topic of conversation whenever Jon Jones pops up, in the last few years. And it sucks that it has to be like that. But my first instinct wasn't to say cheater, or wasn't to say, maybe, it could be the science backed behind it, and he maybe did have a picogram. Mine was just, let's see what happens. I can't even make a conclusion right now. We didn't even have that much information at that point. So I didn't want to label him as anything, and I didn't want to give him heat. I just said, let's let everything play out and see how he addresses it.
So one thing Jon Jones has said and adamantly, denied, he has said that I have never taken performance-enhancing drugs. He said that I have never tried to cheat the sport. I have done cocaine, I have got drunk and been a bad person, but I have never intentionally done a steroid. Do you believe that?
I honestly don't know. I think that there's a lot of things that need to be worked out in terms of drug testing, and hopefully they address that when I believe the UFC did re-partner up with USADA for the next few years. Hopefully they do more substantial testing. But I don't know. I don't know, because a lot.
How about the ones from the one against DC at 214? The estrogen blocker. He popped for estrogen blocker, and so clearly, some people would say clearly he has done PEDs.
Right, exactly. And I don't know if I'm going to make that jump just yet. To be honest, I'm kind of waiting to see what happens after this one, after the post-fight drug testing for the Alexander Gustafsson fight, because if then something else pops, then I'm going to have my concerns. I already started to have those when this test popped up. Maybe he is a cheater, but I still don't know how to feel, and I I'm trying to give benefit of the doubt until something else happens, and I'm just hoping nothing else happens, because he was such a great talent before, but we didn't have extensive drug tests back when he was in his prime, so I can't even make that conclusion that he wasn't taking drugs. I hope he's not intentionally doping to get an advantage, but who knows with John Jones at this point? You really don't know, and I can't even come to a conclusion at that point.
Me personally, and there's a whole, I could go on forever about why, but I personally believe that he cheated, and this is why. He tested positive against DC and blamed the dick pill. The dick pill, that they tested the dick pill. They tested it, and they said that it was not in the dick pill. It had no estrogen. They didn't find it. After he, because they never found it. He went to court, and Jeff Novitzky on JRE asked him, well, what exactly was it the first time? And they said, we never found out. So we never really know what happened. He claims the performance pill, and then this next time, here's what I think. I think John Jones is the greatest fighter to ever live, except when you add, and in my opinion, I've done, greatest list. John will always be my number 2 below Anderson. Now, that might be the time of the MMA that I started. I started in MMA in 2005, and from 2005 to 2013, Anderson was king. He didn't lose. He won 16 in a row or some shit like that. Everybody in the prime, Anderson Silva was amazing. And and people say, well, Anderson tested positive, so did John. You can't say, well, one took PEDs, they both have tested positive, so you can't say that. The only clean athlete is really George St. Pierre in DC, really.
Yeah.
And people argue Fedor, but Fedor wasn't being tested. Who knows? We don't know. and Fedor never fought in the UFC. I can't consider you the GOAT unless you fought in the UFC. But in my personal opinion, John Jones was microdosing, and I'm sure you know what microdosing is. You normally don't microdose with this kind of pill, but that doesn't mean you won't do it.
Right.
You normally wouldn't shoplift, but people still do it. It's so Jeff Novitzky coming out and saying, well, you normally wouldn't microdose with this. That doesn't really mean much. And there's a lot to go into. Frank Mir. I'm sure you know the Frank Mir case. Frank Mir tested positive for the same amount of picograms, and they suspended him for 2 year. And Frank Mir even asked them, hey, is there any way that this has been in my system from a year or 2 ago? And they said, no, Frank, doesn't work like that. So then I remember Joe Rogan, when Jeff Novitzky just went on Joe Rogan, Joe asked Novitzky straight up, why did Frank Mir get 2 years and John didn't? And he said, because John cooperated. John gave us information. So John basically is an informant for USADA, and that helped him, of course. But I believe, and I don't know if you follow American football, but he's got 2 brothers who are both in the NFL, and one of them tested positive for marijuana, and the other one tested positive for a straight steroid. And if you know football, there's no place in the world that you can get more expensive and better steroids than the NFL. And his brother has popped, and that doesn't mean much, but that's his brother. He has access to steroids for sure. And I believe that he's so used to being the GOAT, the greatest. What he did to Shogun, Lyoto, all of them, from even when he first started. I think he's so used to being the greatest that he has that little bit of doubt that, man, maybe DC can beat me, or man, maybe Gustafsson can beat me. So microdosing basically is you get a little bit to help you a little bit instead of getting a lot to help you a lot, basically.
Right.
They're saying, too, that the steroid he popped for, it gets out of your system in 2 hours. So he could have very easily took this, waited 2 hours, and then got tested, So, but I believe that he's always needed just that little edge.
That thought did cross my mind, especially after the first DC fight and the Gustafsson fight, because those are the 2 guys that everyone said has the tools and the skills necessary to finally beat John Jones. And I don't know if that played a role in what he did outside of the cage, because definitely what he did I think did the DC first fight, that one came after the Alexander Gustafsson, right? Or was that before?
That was before.
No,
That was after. That was after.
Yeah, that was after. So after the Gustafsson fight, where he nearly lost, like everyone saw that, and I'm definitely that person that said that night John Jones may not have taken Alexander Gustafsson seriously, and he has since admitted to that, because at that point he felt invincible, and I couldn't blame him because he had about 5 title defenses against the greatest fighters to ever fight in the UFC, and no one knew who Alexander Gustafsson was at the time. They didn't know what he possessed, and then we saw what he did in the first 3 rounds, and then that kind of was like, well, man, maybe John Jones can be beat. So I don't know if that changed his mindset, because he had to ramp up his performance in the final 3 rounds, and the championship was almost taken away from him. Then we get to Daniel Cormier. He says he's going to be the one to stop Jones on the ground, stuff like that. And maybe in his head, he knows that this is an Olympic wrestler. Maybe he could take me down. Alexander Gustafsson, who's not even in that background, took him down. So maybe in Jones's head, he did have that feeling that, maybe I do need a little bit of help just to cement my status, or just to maybe keep that aura of invincibility alive. I never want to say what someone's thinking outright, but it is a very true possibility that is that person's mindset. And then once USADA came in, that's when we started to see the changes, and that's when he started to hop more often. And I know a lot of people wonder if he was on it back then. Again, possibility, but we'll never know.
The only way we'll know is if when John retires, he comes out and says, hey, this is what I was doing my whole career, and tells us the truth, which
right.
is very, very, very unlikely. No athlete does that.
No, you want to be remembered for what you did, and if all you did was dominate, you're not going to come out and say, well, I was dominating while on steroids. No, and then that's it for you. No one cares about what you did anymore. They just know that you are a cheater.
So going into the fight, Gus and John too, I picked Gustafsson, and I also I made 8 picks on the card, and I went 4-4. My upsets, I did pick Nunes, which upset, and I picked Volkanovski, which upset Mendez. I went with Chiesa. I thought Kat Zingano was going to win, but that was a little weird. And then I had Gustafsson against Jones, and it was kind of boring. Like, if we're being honest, there wasn't much action. There wasn't like a knockdown and then another. It wasn't nowhere near compared to their first fight.
Right, and I think sometimes what happens is in a rematch, they try to recreate exactly what happened, or just at least have the same energy, and it doesn't always play out like that. This was 5 years ago they had their first fight. Obviously, they're different fighters now, so they're not going to have the exact same fight. But yeah, when I started watching it, obviously the first round is going to be a feeling out process, and Jones was a little bit pulled ahead at that time. And then as the second and third round kind of came up, I thought